Hello, everyone, and welcome back. I hope that this video reaches you well. Today, we're going to be talking about ancient Greek philosophy, and we're going to be taking think about this as the big picture view, the view from a mile up. I'm going to talk about ancient Greek philosophy as a whole, and then we're going to delve into some specifics with our primary source reading of Plato's Euthyphro. So ancient Greek philosophy lasts roughly for this 500-year chunk from, as we'll see here in a second, most historians slash philosophers will say that ancient Greek philosophy began with the Greek philosopher Thales, 525 BC. There's a lot of debate about when it ended. It didn't technically end, but I would say that it lasts roughly till the rise of Christianity, because it's with Christianity that we get the intermixing of Greek, Roman, and Middle Eastern Jewish thought slash theology slash philosophy. So it has this 500-year run, but Greek philosophy will become the foundation for the Western tradition as a whole. Now, if you look at the history of philosophy as it stretches across human history, we have this basic division between Western philosophy and Eastern philosophy. Western philosophy, generally speaking, refers to those philosophical traditions that are rooted in and or derive from the Greek tradition. And this includes a whole host of different philosophical traditions. Roman philosophy, Christian philosophy. There's about 1,000-year period where Western philosophy is synonymous with Christian philosophy. Figures like St. Augustine, St. Anselm, St. Thomas Aquinas. But all of those figures are distinctly Western. Even Enlightenment philosophy, as we'll see later on in the 16th and 17th century, is of the Western tradition. And later, a later philosopher named Albert Whitehead will say that all philosophy, all Western philosophy, is simply a footnote to Plato, the ancient Greek philosopher. And this is because, and this is a super dramatic oversimplification, but the idea that Whitehead is trying to convey is that the core ideas, the core principles of philosophy date all the way back to the Greek tradition. All of the main areas of philosophy that I talked about in the Intro to Philosophy video, of course, derive from the Greek tradition. So we're going to talk about the Greek tradition as a whole, some of the important people of the Greek tradition, and then we'll deal specifically with Plato's Euthyphro. So let's jump straight to it. So as I said before, most people would say that Greek philosophy began with the philosopher Thales. Now, got a little bit more jargon here for you, okay? So Greek philosophy is generally divided between the Pre-Socratics and the Socratics. And the name, I think, makes sense, right? Pre-Socratic philosophers are those philosophers who came before Socrates. And the Socratic philosophers, of course, are the philosophers who came after Socrates. And you could also say that one of the big differences between these two groups, between the Pre-Socratics and the Socratics, are the subjects that they like to talk about. If we were to generalize most pre-Socratic philosophers, most of these guys are interested in what's referred to as cosmology, questions about the origin and nature of the universe, specifically, where did the Earth, now their idea of the universe was radically different from ours, but They were preoccupied with this question: where did the universe come from? How did we get here? What was that process like? Unfortunately, for most of the pre-Socratic philosophers, not much of their writing survives. In fact, the writing that does survive, we only get little chunks of, or in some cases, we only know about these people through the writings of the Socratic philosophers, such as Aristotle, who will oftentimes reference other pre-Socratics, such as Anaxander, right? Aristotle will say something along the lines of, as Anaxander has argued, or as Minos has argued, or whatever, right? So yeah, the most famous of the pre-Socratics was Thales, and we have a little bit of Thales's writing has survived, but the thing that he was most famous for, and this proves to be a hallmark event in the history of philosophy. Later philosophers like Bertrand Russell will say that this is the beginning of philosophy in 585 BC. Thales successfully predicted a solar eclipse. And this is a quote from the Greek historian Herodotus, who describes this event. Now, apparently there was a war that was currently happening between these two empires, the Lydians and the Medes. And this is what Herodotus says, that they're fighting. Suddenly the day was turned to night. This event had been foretold by Thales, the Milesian, who forewarned the Ionians of it. The Ionian colonies were Greek colonies in modern day Turkey. If you look at a map, it's just right across the Aegean Sea there. Lots of history there, but different story for a different day. Thales, who had forewarned the Ionians of it, fixing for it the very year which it actually took place. The Medes and the Lydians, when they observed the change, ceased fighting and were alike anxious to have terms of peace agreed upon. So we have this monumentous event, this solar eclipse that takes place, that was predicted date and time by this Greek philosopher. Now, why is this considered to be the beginning of philosophy? Well, the traditional narrative goes that this is the first time in the Western tradition, anyways. So Thales predicted the solar eclipse based off of his cosmological understanding of the universe, based off the mathematical calculations that he had done. And that sounds like a, well, yeah, no duh type statement for us, right? That's, I mean, predicting a solar eclipse is amazing, yes, but scientists today do that sort of thing all the time, right? This was the first time in history that you have this separation that occurs, the separation between, and this is again, this is a oversimplification, but a separation between religious explanations, bear with me a second, religious explanations and philosophical explanations. You see, prior to Thales, cosmology, the study of the universe, was primarily a religious endeavor. People did it. Most ancient civilizations have some form of cosmological study, typically in the form of what we would today call, and this is, I'm throwing a lot of jargon at you and I apologize, but you have this distinction. Nowadays we would call it astronomy, but it was really astrology. right? Most ancient civilizations practiced some form of astrology, astrology being the belief that the stars, the alignments of the planets have some sort of impact slash influence on human affairs slash events, right? For most ancient civilizations, the study of the stars was intimately linked with the study of the gods, because the stars, the night sky itself was divine. So if you ever look back at a culture like the Mayans are a really great example of this, right? Why did the Mayans put all of that effort into building all of those pyramids and developing all of those astronomical books? It's because the study of the heavens was a divine pursuit. You were observing the movements of the gods, and the belief was that the movements of the stars could tell you something about the past, present, and future. So it was a highly sought after endeavor. But in most of these cultures, in all of these cultures, this study is tied in with religious beliefs about the divine. The difference with Thales is that his predictions were not. Thales treated the eclipse, from what we understand, as a natural phenomenon, and believed that the heavens, the quote unquote heavens, the stars, the universe, that all of it could be studied in this way. So instead of appealing to religion, instead of appealing to divine concepts, Thales appears to a naturalistic philosophy, a philosophy that is not dependent upon supernatural slash paranormal explanation of events. And this is why, for people like Bertrand Russell, this is why Thales is the first philosopher, right? Hopefully that makes sense. If not, let me know. Now, there's, like I said before, there's several other pre-Socratic philosophers. If you're interested in this stuff, I'll link the page to Stanford Encyclopedia's of Philosophy's page on the Pre-Socratics. This would be a really interesting area to do a research project on. But we are going to move right along to the Socratic philosophers. So the Pre-Socratics and the Socratics. Now, the big three of Greek philosophy: Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. Socrates was the teacher of Plato. Plato was the teacher of Aristotle. And all of these guys had very different views slash understandings of the world, as we'll see here shortly. And what I'm going to do here, I'm not going to give you a very detailed introduction. I mean, if you were to go, ask philosophers, do like a dumb little poll, who's the smartest people, who's the smartest person that ever lived? In the top, I'm willing to bet in the top 5, top 3 of those answers is going to be Plato or Aristotle, either number 1 or number 2. Those would be my only acceptable answers if I were to give that on a test, which I won't, because that's dumb. But Plato and Aristotle, I was about to say single-handedly, together, Plato and Aristotle create our contemporary understanding of philosophy. They each write a tremendous amount of work that people have respectively dedicated their entire lives to studying. So I'm not going to be able to even hit the tip of the iceberg here. Now, we're going to skip Socrates for now, because I'm going to tell you about the story of Socrates when we read the Euthyphro together. But Socrates features predominantly in Plato's dialogues. So Plato is the student of Socrates, and Plato's philosophical writing comes in the forms of these dialogues that he writes over the course of his life. Now, a dialogue is structured as a debate, conversation between almost always Socrates and some interlocutor. In the case of Euthyphro, it's going to be Socrates and Euthyphro. And it's Socrates having a conversation with these people about all sorts of different things: love, knowledge, beauty, ethics, truth, justice, all the big topics, right? Now, I said before, Plato wrote a number of dialogues. These dialogues can be divided into different sections, different periods. And the reason why scholars do this, so let me back up a little bit. Plato wrote a whole lot of books. Aristotle wrote a whole lot of books. Socrates, as far as we know, didn't write anything. Everything that we know about Socrates, as far as what his beliefs / teachings were, come predominantly from Plato. Now, there are other Greek writers who write about Socrates. The most famous example being the Greek playwright Aristophanes, who wrote a play called The Clouds, in which he has a very comical depiction of Socrates' teachings. But again, different topic. So the idea behind Plato's writing is that Plato writes these dialogues throughout the course of his life, all of which feature Socrates. And the idea is that the early dialogues, specifically the Apology, the Crito, the Euthyphro, and the Phaedo, which recount the trial and death of Socrates that Plato was there for, that these early dialogues reflect Socrates' actual beliefs, and that the later dialogues, specifically the Timaeus, I included the Phaedo in the early dialogues. Phaedo is a later dialogue. The Phaedo, the Symposium, the Timaeus, reflect more Plato's belief. And if you read these dialogues, you can see that there's, in fact, a big difference between the two. Now, the contents of these dialogues is too much to name, but I do want to touch upon what is, without a doubt, the most important idea that was introduced by Plato, and that's Plato's theory of the forms. Now, you may have seen this image before. It's become somewhat of a meme in the past year or two. So Plato, and you may have heard of Plato's theory of the forms before. Plato has this idea. It's introduced. You'll see it you'll see it a little bit at work in the Euthyphro, when Socrates and Euthyphro are talking about this idea of piety. And so Socrates will say, Euthyphro, what is piety? And Euthyphro will give a bunch of examples. Piety is doing what the gods love. Piety is doing as I'm doing now. Piety is bringing your father to justice. Piety is giving sacrifices to the gods. Piety is praying, offering prayers to the gods. And Socrates will say, well, Euthyphro, all of those are examples of what piety is. I asked you to tell me what piety itself is. What is piety? And this might seem like Socrates is being hung up on the definition of the word, but it goes deeper than the definition. It goes to the idea that lies beyond the definition. So another popular example of this is beauty. And I can't remember which dialogue this is, but Socrates is having a conversation with someone, asking them this question: well, what is beauty? And they'll talk, and you'll give several examples of beauty, and Socrates will say, well, why is it that I can look up at the night sky, look up at the moon and say, wow, the moon is beautiful, and then look at my wife and say, wow, my wife is beautiful. What is it that connects those two, right? One's a giant floating rock, and the other one's a very lovely, I'm sure Socrates had a wife, I'm sure was a very lovely human being. So what makes the two things beautiful? And what Socrates is getting after is that our concepts and ideas about things like truth, beauty, justice, that we have these, that we can apply these ideas to individual cases because we have this larger idea of what those things actually are. And that each one of those examples are simply a reflection of what true beauty or true justice actually is. And so what Socrates is getting at in those dialogues is what Plato calls the forms. The forms are kind of, you can think about the forms as the template for reality. It's what reality is based on, and it's what reality is constructed from. It's where reality derives its essence from. And this picture here specifically comes from Plato's Republic, and this is what's referred to as the allegory of the cave. And this is what Plato gives to explain the forms. So the bottom left of the picture here, we have these, and this is the example that Plato himself sets up. You have these people, Plato says that they're chained to the wall, their necks are fixed, and the only thing that they can do all day is stare at the wall. And behind them is a fire that's producing a light. Now, of course, they don't know that it's a fire. But all they can see on the wall are shadows that dance around before them, right? Shadow of a tree, and it's a bird, as you can see here. Shadows that dance around before them. And Plato says, suppose one day one of these men get free from the chains. They climb over the wall, and they see that there are these priests there holding up these little cutouts of these things that are making the shadows. They see the fire. The fire is what's producing the light that's casting the shadow. They climb out of the cave into the real world, and they see the true light, the light of the sun. And then they see things as they actually are. They see a real bird, a real tree, a real vase. Plato says that this is where we are now in this world, and that this world is merely a shadow of reality. That true reality is the reality of the forms, but we only catch shadows of it. Now, this can also be interpreted, these priests here can also be interpreted as government, right? That government has society bound and chained and is only presenting to society a shadow of fabrication of what it's really like. Lots of different interpretation of Plato's allegory. It's a phenomenal allegory, and you're more than welcome to explore this on your own. There's a ton of literature that's been written on this, but that's very, very loosely speaking Plato's theory of the forms. There's a lot more to it than that, but that's just the little tip of the iceberg there. Now, Aristotle, I'm afraid I'm going to be even less informative on, just due to the sheer amount of topics that Aristotle covered. Aristotle, without a doubt, probably the most prolific philosopher who ever lived. Aristotle, for sure, an overachiever, right? The guy single-handedly developed the philosophy of logic. He created philosophical logical syllogisms, 125 logical syllogisms. He basically created the field of biology, metaphysics, the study of poetics, the study of rhetoric, the study of politics. It's honestly, it's ridiculous. He could have saved at least a little bit for the rest of us, but no. Um, there's no there's no one central idea for Aristotle like there is for Plato, just due to how he wrote about these things. Now, I said before that Aristotle was the student of Plato. Aristotle, however, did not accept Plato's ideas. He specifically, he rejected Plato's theory of the forms, opting instead in terms of explanations about the natural world. You do see um, not really a scientific understanding. It's not really empiricism like we think of science today, but Aristotle he'll try to categorize biological species. Well, he didn't have the concept of species, but he'll try to group slash categorize animals, for example. He does the same thing with logic, right? As I mentioned in the intro video, logic being the rules that govern our thinking. Aristotle will develop the logical syllogisms, some of the most basic logical patterns that we still use, modus ponens, modus tollens, were all developed by Aristotle. You have the beginning of science here. Aristotle will apply the same sort of classification system that he did to logic, will be applied to the natural world, like I said before, to things like biology. You have the introduction of metaphysics, the search for the ultimate causes of the universe of things. Aristotle will develop a pivotal theory of ethics that's outlined in his Nicomachean Ethics. Aristotle's ethics will also pave the way for Aristotle's understanding and study of politics, all of which have been hugely, hugely influential on the Western tradition. There is an infinite amount more that I could say about both of those two philosophers. I don't want to make this video go on too long, so I'll stop to there. Hopefully that was a adequate enough introduction. And again, I'll post some links to some general pages that kind of walk through their philosophy in a bit more detail. All right, that's all I got for today. I'll see you guys next time.